Speaking of his guardian and regent of the Temple people, a young Nelson Mandela observed that the chief bore all the hallmarks of a good leader, as someone that keeps his people together in times of hardship. The idea of good leaders that unite rather than divide doesn't just ring true, it just sounds good, doesn't it? So, welcome to If I Ruled the World. It's episode 12, and it's amazing that it's taken this long, but today we're going to be talking about leadership with someone who's used to being at the helm, Craig Bennett, who is the chief executive of the Wildlife Trusts. Now, this is an organization that unites 46 independent charities that work to protect and restore nature, wildlife and wild places right across the UK, which is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, and that's according to the Biodiversity Intactness Index. So let's just say it's a big job. Craig is the UK's, or is one of the UK's leading environmental campaigners, and has been the CEO at the Wildlife Trust since 2019. He took up the post soon after I met him in a beer tent at a festival, which has nothing to do with anything other than being true. But yeah, he was once described as, I don't know if he's going to like this, but this is what they said in The Guardian. He was described as an eco-general. And I've definitely always been struck in the times that I've had a chance to speak to Craig, that he's always been really willing to talk very openly about politics, which, for some reason, I always used to get the sense that there was this code or unwritten agreement that conservationists and nature people basically just stay clear of politics. I don't know where I got that from, and it's probably not true, but certainly that's what struck me about Craig. Because he's made it his business to meet politics and politicians head on in dealing with government and leaders, as well as being a leader himself. So in our conversation, we dig into Craig, the CEO, and Craig, the man, which, to be honest, doesn't feel world apart as one might expect. We talked about his very early awakenings as an environmentalist to, all the usual planet-sized challenges that environmentalists and conservationists face. And we also talked about the really urgent need for good leadership and what that actually looks like.
I was born in Rainham in Essex, right near Rainham Marshes, which people might have heard about.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Hornchurch in Essex in the 1970s and 1980s. And this was classic sort of suburban Essex-London boundaries. I mean, literally, I saw the M25 being built, for example, to put it in context. And it's not like I had a particular kind of wild upbringing or anything like that. Yes, my mum was a bit into recycling and things like that. But I mean, I didn't have particular sort of nature parents or anything like that. I was in pretty classic suburban lifestyle, really. But for one reason or another, which I still don't fully understand, in my mid-teens, I really got into environmental activism, felt really passionate about it. This was in the mid-1980s. And knew that that's where I wanted to go for the rest of my life, really, both around not just nature issues, but also nature and climate, but also resource efficiency and all of those things. For me, just from quite early in my teens, it seemed pretty obvious that the way the world was going and the way the world worked was totally bonkers. And this was not the next step of human progress, the way things were going. Actually, the next step of human progress clearly would be to be learning to live fairly within environmental limits, and that's what's driven me for so much of my life and career.
So I find that really interesting that you say for reasons you don't really understand. But is there like anything like that you can remember, a detail that you saw as you're growing up that made you think this isn't right?
I think the things that really stood out for me were just actually, I followed the political debates quite a lot in the 1980s, and there was a sort of a green surge, as it were, in the mid-1980s. It's when, for example, Friends of the Earth suddenly grew really fast. There was this kind of wave of green activism in the mid-1980s, and I was really hooked into that. I remember seeing Jonathan Porritt, who was the director of Friends of the Earth at that point, on BBC Question Time late one night. Now, you could also ask, pretty sad thing for a 14-year-old boy to be doing, watching Question Time
I wasn't going to say anything.
As a teenager. But I watched that night, and he was the only person I thought on the panel that made any sense that night from across the political parties. And it just really stood out to me. And it was just a very profoundly different way of looking at the world to how all the mainstream politicians were discussing it at the time. There were obviously news stories that happened then. I mean, I grew up with Chernobyl, for example, or the Caribbean was this toxic waste ship that was exporting toxic waste to Africa, that just toxic waste from Britain, and it was trying to take it to Africa and trying to dump it in Africa, which was just, this story was exposed, I think, by Friends of the Earth. And that just hit me really strongly, is how on earth can anyone think that's right to do that? I remember, if I'm honest, in my primary school in the late 70s, I mean, this might sound like I'm making it up, but it's really not. I remember it was like a programme for schools or something, BBC programme for schools. And that's the first time I heard mention of what we now talk about as the greenhouse effect and climate change. And I remember that just this line, zooming in on a car exhaust. And I must have been, 9 or 10 at the time, and talking about, some scientists say this might lead to quite profound shifts in the climate. And somehow that stuck in my mind. Why this is the case, I don't know. I remember in my first year at secondary school doing a project in the holidays called My Garden is a Nature Reserve, which now, given the role I'm in now, I find quite entertaining. So these things were all there in bits and pieces, but exactly where and how they came from, there's no single moment. But it just always struck me that the way the rest of the world is wired, and the systems we have in the world just don't seem to make much sense. I mean, I don't see how a lot of the way we live our lives globally at the moment is much good for humanity long term, let alone good for nature and the environment. And I think I've always felt that. And I felt that the big battle, the big debate in the 21st century for humanity is, are we going to learn to live on this planet as if we mean to stay? And if so, we've got to learn to live in harmony with nature. And for that, we've got to do that in a much more equitable way for that to work for humanity as well. And that, to me, defines whether humanity will have a next step of progress or not, or whether we'll end up in the way that so many other previous human civilizations have ended up, which is crashing and burning.
So do you think you're driven more from a place of, this isn't fair, rather than I love nature?
I really think it's both. I think it's probably fair to say that the I love nature thing was most immediately obvious to me growing up. But as life has gone on, I've become more aware of just the unbelievable unfairness in the world and how all these issues are inextricably linked. Now I think they're pretty indivisible in my mind. There's no way we're going to learn to live in harmony with nature, in balance with nature. There's no way we're going to be able to tackle climate change or the nature crisis unless we also tackle the incredible inequality and injustice that's also in the world. These things are absolutely wrapped together. And it's extraordinary that sometimes that still has to be explained, but it does. A lot of people don't get that at all. So I think these things are sort of inextricably linked. And actually the way I link them is just under that word progress that you've already heard me say a few times here. I think for me, perhaps one of the mistakes of the environmental community over the years is we talk about these issues as if they're separate from everything else. We talk about the climate crisis and the nature crisis, or we talk about inequality as if it's a kind of bolt-on or separate issue to what mainstream politics might sort of think about is some kind of political progress. But no, they are all bound up in that. Where are we going as humanity? What is the point of all this unless it's to try to lead to a better life for everyone? And surely that means doing that fairly and in a way that this planet can sustain and thrive, more to the point. And surely that's the defining question in so many ways for the 21st century. And yet actually, how often do we really talk about that in our politics?
I notice this a lot with primary age children, particularly, that once they discover that the most important jobs in terms of who gets paid the most aren't the firefighters of the world, they're not the kind of ambulance drivers, the people that are going to basically save your life when the shit hits the fan, basically.
All the people we applauded during COVID, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. And I know that like a lot of kids get really confused about that, and it just does not make sense. So when I'm listening to you, it sounds to me like you saw something that didn't make sense and you've never let go of that. What do you think happens to people like between that age and being a grown-up, where you sort of start to ignore or decide to argue for what we know rather than fight for a better future? What happens?
I think a lot of people try and, the system, if you like, tries to tell you to line up and behave and to buy into the suggestion that the emperor's got clothes, as it were. I mean, my example of that is, again, I think I was, 15 or something. And I remember going for a meeting with a careers teacher at school because we all had to go and have one. And I remember him saying to me, he said, "Craig, what do you want to be when you grow up?" I'm sure it wasn't quite that question, but that sort of question. And I said, "I want to be an environmental campaigner." And this was, again, in the mid-1980s. And he looked at me a bit perplexed. And he didn't have a code for that on his then BBC B microcomputer in the mid-1980s. So he said, "Well, we can't do that." So instead he typed in the code to be a careers teacher, and the dot matrix printer printed off what A-levels I might need and what degree I might need to go and do to become a careers teacher, which I promptly then completely ignored.
Wow.
But it was just so bizarre that he couldn't process that would be something I'd want to do for my career, say. And thankfully I ignored him and went off and did geography degree. Yes, because I thought that would be very helpful for what I wanted to do as an environmental campaigner, but also I was fascinated in the subject. And then was focused on becoming an environmental campaigner in different ways. And I had very flexibility within that, what I might focus on. I was interested in it all, if you like. But you have to be pretty determined and perhaps a little bit stubborn to stick with your guns, because a lot of people would try and encourage you that that's surely not the direction to go, that's not the career, or this would be better.
So one of the things that I was really hoping that you can help me out with, Craig, is trying to figure out what the hell happened in the last 30 years. I think it was around 2017. I was a stay-at-home mom at the time. Both my kids were born. They're really young. And I think it was really, apart from the fact that, obviously I love my kids, but it was a great opportunity to take a step back. I didn't know this is what was going to happen, to be honest, but I took a step back from pretty much everything. And I became quite isolated from the people I used to work with. Like all the structures that I had in place before I became a mom pretty much disappeared. So for those years, I was a little bit adrift and just very focused on just trying to keep two little people alive, basically, and well. And one of the things that happened in 2017 was there was this paper called A Warning Letter to Humanity, A Second Notice, or I think it was a scientist's warning to humanity, a second notice, you'll know it. And it sort of charted, essentially, the way I looked at it, a lot of the milestones in this warning letter hit a few milestones in my life. So I was born just, I think, a year after the first Earth Summit in Rio. Then by the time I went to university, there was, I think, the second one, so that would have been 92. And then by 2017, 25 years on, this next paper comes out. And it's like, we've told you once, we're telling you again, it's not looking good. And when you look at all the graphs in the paper, I mean, everything looks like from that period, 25 to 30 years, everything just ramped up. Like all the environmental indicators just got exponentially worse. Almost all but one, actually. But what I want to know from someone like you, who's probably way more qualified than me to talk about this, is what do you think has gone wrong in the last 30 years? Why do you think we've seen this dramatic worsening of environmental indicators in the last 30 years?
The reason ultimately things have gone wrong in terms of environmental indicators is, the huge globalized economy, and in particular, I would say neoliberalism, which is about trying to put the economy first and trying to focus on growth, economic growth and GDP and all of those kind of indicators first, over and above actually protecting the life support systems on which this is all based. Very simply, I put it like this, is that we know, you and I know, that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature. You could get rid of the economy and nature be fine. But actually, if you get rid of nature, then the economy won't exist. And yet what's happened in our global political systems and our cultural systems is we behaved as if it's the other way round. At the same time, also as humanity in our culture, we've defined our own individual progress in that where our status is as society by how much we consume and how much we own and how much we display in that regard. To an extent, there's been an element of that in human civilizations for years, but it's gone massive in an age of consumerism, global supply chain and all of these kind of things. So we all end up putting so much effort into earning money that enables us to buy many more things than we would ever need, either for survival, certainly way more for them survival, and even to be happy. And in the process, in the meantime, politicians and our political systems have utterly failed to put the basic systems and regulations in place to enable this to be done in a way that's sustainable.
What I find interesting is you haven't mentioned and it's actually a line of inquiry I don't like myself, but the thing I hear a lot in terms of what's happened in the last 30 years is that the human population is like there's loads more people. The reason why I just sometimes just think, well, maybe, because my question is always, well, what are we going to do then? But do you think that's part of it? Do you think that if we had better political and economic systems in place, do you think that even with the current number of people on the planet, so I think it's past 8 billion now, we'd be in better shape?
Well, the population issue is a question I pretty much always get. If I'm doing a public meeting, and I do a lot of them, it always comes up towards the end. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment.
Yeah.
But the answer I always give is, of course, you can't say it's irrelevant. The number of people on the planet does make a difference to how much we consume and on the carrying capacity of the planet. That's absolutely clear. But it's a function not just of how many people there are on the planet, but actually the consumption footprint of each of those individuals on the planet. And the fact is that in rich countries like the UK, of course, we consume vast amount more per person. I'm just as guilty as everyone else, but we consume vast amounts per person, way more than people in the poorest countries. So if we're going to have a conversation about population, it cannot just be a question about the numbers of people. It needs to be a conversation about the numbers of people plus how much they individually consume. And the first thing, if you live in the rich world, that we need to do is think about how, therefore, we reduce our own personal individual consumption footprints. And I say footprints because actually that might not necessarily mean having less of the thing you ultimately need. Thinking about lighting or heating, for example, actually what you need is light and heat. It's not necessarily the amount of electricity that's needed to generate it if you've got much more efficient light bulbs and much better insulated houses, for example. So you can still have your light and heat, we just do it much more efficiently. And that, again, is a microcosm of how we could do that about so many other things. So actually, we need to drastically reduce our consumption footprint in the global north, in the rich countries. Obviously, we can't go on as humanity ever increasing the amount of people on the planet without it causing problems. But actually, a lot of estimations, a lot of modelling suggests that we probably will flatten out global population at around 9, 10, 11 billion at some point this century. And obviously, probably flattening out earlier rather than better would be good for humanity. And I always have a lot of fun in saying that, because normally the question that from the back of the room normally comes from quite an old white male that asks the question. So the other part that I sometimes have fun saying, the other reason population has increased is because people are living longer, particularly in the global north. And isn't that a good thing? But that's the thing to bear in mind in this. It's very often when that question is put in a way that is quite accusatory to people in the global south. But I think that we really have to look at ourselves, our consumption habits in the global north, and actually the lack of equality in the world, and actually the lack of gender equality in the world, to really understand some of the tensions that have led to where we are now on that, and actually to what the solutions to that might be.
That's really interesting, because it's actually reminded me of some research into human demographics, which suggests that there may be an even more important factor alongside education, particularly for women and girls, and equality, which is reducing infant mortality.
Exactly.
And it's quite shocking, the the data in places where particularly, there's high infant mortality, you tend to have higher birth rates. So actually the single biggest thing we could possibly do is to reduce infant mortality. And I often think, wow, well, who would argue against that? Yeah.
Well, funny enough, people did argue against it. Here in this country, there was the big campaigns to cut foreign aid, as it were. Some of certain newspapers in this country pushed campaigns to cut what was called foreign aid. Well, when that was reduced, actually what got cut were programs to try and reduce infant mortality, and actually cut also UK overseas aid spending on education for women and girls. So ironically, actually, programs that were being used in development spending by UK government, the ones that help exactly this issue, were the ones that got cut.
Where does that lack of compassion come from?
Well, it's one of the things that really worries me is that I think you say what went wrong in the last 3 decades, but I think something that I've really observed in the last decade is actually an increase in the lack of compassion, if that's such a thing. We do seem to have turned inward. I mean, that's in the UK, but it seems to be happening globally, actually. I mean, it's not like I've invented this. I'm not the first person to say this, but we have seen over the last decade this rise of populism, post-truth, nationalism and so on in our politics in the global north, certainly. I mean, parts of the global south as well. And at the precise moment when nature and global humanity needs us to be looking out and working together much more as a global population and a global system to try and find global answers to these problems, actually in our politics and many of our political leaders seem to be turning us inwards, facing inwards into our own societies and cooperating, collaborating less. And I think the problem is yes, that can come from a lack of compassion, but actually it enhances that lack of compassion. It feeds itself. Actually, the less we interact with other cultures, the less we understand other cultures, and the less we think internationally, the less compassion we will have and the less familiar we will have. The more we will be scared of other peoples and people who are different from us.
I feel like I have a little confession to make, which is I spend a lot of time looking, like being really nosy and looking on the other side of the fence to see what the platforms that I think most people would say are really toxic and really taboo. I'm like, I want to go and see that. I want to see what people are saying. It's quite an eye-opener. So I'm talking about, Rumble, BitChute, and they're essentially platforms in the way I see it and the way I understand it, where there's very little censorship, there's very little restrictions on what you can say. So it's like a free-for-all. There's a lot of stuff that is really hard to take in, but I find it quite an education. I find it important almost for me to understand how it's possible. Here we are with all the research, all the data, all the reporting, all the education, that there's still a significant enough proportion of the population in this country, in the States and other countries, that don't see it the way I do. And so for me, I'm like, well, why is that? And also, more importantly, am I missing something? And I think where I'm at, where I sit with all of that now is that I'm always like, could we find new language? And this isn't sort of like doublespeak kind of new language. I mean, can we reframe what it is we're worrying about? So we don't just default to words like climate and nature crisis, because I'm pretty sure that instantly switches off or pushes away, or worse still, triggers people that, for whatever reason, are resistant to change. So is this a bigger problem than just simply the metric of carbon emissions? Because to me, it has to be bigger than carbon emissions, because even with renewable energy, if we're only fixing this one metric, we potentially are creating more problems for ourselves down the line. So we have to look at things holistically. So if you were trying to talk about these concerns to an audience that perhaps don't buy into the climate narrative, how would you sell that?
Well, actually, I was mentioning before, I am planning to take about three months off over the next few months to write a book that I've been trying to do in my head for years. And actually, I call the book Progress, and it is trying to get into this directly. And one of the things I'm trying to do is it is to answer a heckle that I got about 35 years ago when I was doing a talk and handing out leaflets on air pollution. And most of the day, people were taking leaflets off me. But halfway through the day, this old guy came up to me and shouted in my face. He said, "You can't stop progress." And it always stuck with me that his vision of progress was more cars and more pollution, that equaled progress. And so I've been thinking for a long time about how to best answer that heckle. And I think ultimately, if you try and understand what the concept of progress is, ultimately it boils down to trying to get ever better meeting human needs in the broadest sense of the word.
I think safety as well, in terms of human needs, is a really important one.
Yeah.
I sometimes wonder if that's actually the primary driver. Like, obviously you need water, but feeling safe is up there with food and water. And the question of safety and how many people on the planet don't feel safe.
Yeah.
Human dignity is another one, which I think, well, that's a difficult one to measure, but it's actually Sam. I remember as Sam, producer Sam, one of the first conversations we had when we were talking about the podcast and trying to size each other up, and Sam just mentioned human dignity as a kind of really important part of like this story, and I was like, whoa, okay, that's not something that I think of, or I hear a lot anyway. So I think there is a lot we're still missing, I think, as a movement in terms of how we communicate around this. And I guess that's what I'm trying to drill into with this podcast and sort of like really shake things up, because, or at least not just for my thinking, and hopefully if my thinking loosens around some of these like well-oiled narratives, then maybe that will help someone else to see something differently.
Well, it's funny you mentioned about dignity, because I completely agree on that. And funny enough, one of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs that he was arguing that you address once you've got your food and water, once you've got your security and so on, is actually self-esteem, which is another form of kind of sort of related to dignity. And I think one of the things that's interesting, going back to what we were saying earlier, is increasingly the way we try and meet self-esteem in our consumer society now is to go shopping and to buy more branded goods and to use those as sort of emblems about where we are in society and so on. In actual fact, if we're trying to get off the consumer treadmill, and you can try and give people ways in which they can feel self-esteem that aren't about consumption, but could be about empowerment. It could be access to lifelong learning and continuing education for people that want it. And it could be other things in society that give people that self-esteem and belonging and so on, that will feed into that and feed into dignity. Let's not think that dignity and self-esteem all has to be delivered by go and get some good January sales in a shopping centre. But that seems to be where society's gone a little bit.
Yeah.
And so I think it is all wrapped up in this.
I was thinking about the charitable sector, and particularly the nature NGOs in this country. Combine them. I mean, the Wildlife Trust has got a massive membership combined, right? It's like
920,000.
Yeah, so just short of 1 million. I call that just short. But once you combine that with the other big NGOs, RSPB,
1.2 million.
Oh my gosh, WWF. That way, I guess that's.
I'm not sure actually. They're less of a concept of membership, I think. But yeah.
But in terms of membership, it represents
National Trust about 6 million.
Whoa. Okay. So my question is, what's going on in the charitable sector? I'm thinking specifically about a little bit of within our kind of community, it was a big deal. The RSPB got into a bit of trouble last year about a tweet where they named a lot of politicians liars for going back on their word on environmental policies. And the Charity Commission had to step in. And it really made me question sort of, well, A, who makes up these rules? And why is there this kind of onus on charities to stay out of politics?
Well, look, the first thing to say is there's no requirement on charities to stay out of politics as such. The requirement is that we don't get involved in party politics. So we can't, under charity regulations in this country, charities can't say vote for this party or vote for that party. But we can and do get political. You have to. Everything we do is political in one sense or another. And charities always have got involved in political issues. And that's entirely right that we do so. In the same way, charities can and should campaign. Often campaigning is by far and away the cheapest, most effective way to deliver on charitable objectives. You're not going to solve climate change just through lots of individual practical projects, although they will have a role to play as well. You have to kind of campaign for the policy changes to get there as well. What there is a conversation perhaps about, and there's some parts of the political spectrum would love to say that charities should never get political, but of course they're doing that ironically for political reasons. That's the whole reason they're saying that. So actually the attacks that often take place on charities when being political are themselves inherently very political. I think, to my mind, it's very clear. The first thing to understand is deep in the history of most British charities, we come from a background of campaigning and political engagement. If you think about the very founders of the National Trust, Octavia Hill was this amazing woman campaigner for landscape and for heritage protection. Beatrix Potter, one of the figures early in the history of the National Trust, she did a huge amount to try and protect nature and landscape in the Lake District in particular. So that's deep in the start of the National Trust. The RSPB, deep in their history, were women coming together to campaign to stop the trade in feathers from tropical birds, for example. And in the Wildlife Trust, so many of our local trusts, particularly the urban ones, started with communities coming together to campaign to protect local spaces. So that's deep in our DNA as to how many of charities, particularly environmental charities in Britain, started. So to deny that is to deny what we started about in the first place. The second thing is our job is to deliver on our charitable purposes. And we should do that fairly and without favour. So that means we need to tell the truth about what's happening in the world, or tell the truth about the impact that a particular policy would have or not. And the moment we hold back from doing that, because you don't want to offend a certain group of people or whatever, that's the very definition of them being party political. So I think we have to speak out, we have to tell the truth. There's an issue about getting the tone right and probably not over-personalising it, and there's things about that that are right. But I think it's absolutely the job of charities to engage in political debate and campaigning in support of our charitable purpose. And the moment we hold back from that, actually we're not doing what charities should be doing.
And if you rule the world, Craig, what would you do?
Goodness. Well, it's very simple. We should stop doing all the bad stuff and start doing lots of good stuff. Now, to expand that a lot, it is insane when you stop and think about it, about how much public money is being used all the time to do stuff that we know is bad. So all those public subsidies, taxpayers' subsidies going into unsustainable industrialised agriculture, all those taxpayers' subsidies going into producing yet more fossil fuels. I could go on and on and on. But there's so many things we know that's bad, and yet we're still doing them. And there's so many things that we think are good, be it renewable energy, regenerative agriculture, investing in communities that lead to community enhancement and enrichment, education, for example. That shouldn't be just something that gets the crumbs. That should be something that's right up there in society. Invest in all the good stuff we know that enhances society for the long term. That would be my headline answer. Mm-hmm. It's pretty simple at that level. Stop doing the bad stuff, put more effort into all the good stuff, because we know what the bad stuff is and we know what the good stuff is.
I love it when my guest basically spells out what our sponsors do. Triodos Bank UK is all about money for positive change. So Triodos is an ethical and sustainable bank that exists to serve individuals, businesses and communities who want to change the world for the better. With almost 40 years of experience in financing positive change, Triodos believes banks should be open and transparent about what they do with your money. So they publish details of every organisation they lend to on their website, proudly financing businesses and charities working in environment and culture and in social change and social justice. For all these reasons, it is a joy to tell you about Triodos, the exclusive sponsors of If I Rule the World. Producer Sam, do you mind if I refer to you as Producer Sam, has asked a follow-up question, which is, if you couldn't rule the world or don't want to, who would you nominate?
Well, I think actually probably the answer to this feels a little bit of a cop-out, but of course the answer is we don't just want one person ruling the world.
Oh, come on.
I
thought you were going to say me.
No. Well, you can have that if you want, Gillian. But,
no, I really don't want the job.
But I'm sort of embarrassed to say this because it does sound a bit of a cliche, but I mean, we need to give a much bigger voice, and we need to give a much greater hands on the rudder to younger people in all of this. It drives me mad when you see decisions constantly made by people my age or older without really having the involvement of younger people in those, and where it's going to affect younger generations a lot more. And there must be ways in which we can think of political systems that give younger people much more of a voice, because on so many of the issues that we've been talking about here, broadly, younger generations get it a lot better than older ones, and they will be much more affected by it. And yet still far too many of the decisions in the world, far too much of the power in the world sits with older generations. And it's not about all or nothing, of course it's not. But there must be a way in which we can find a stronger voice, support a stronger voice and stronger power for younger people.
So would you even go as far as saying sort of pre-voting age, under 18s?
Yeah, I mean, I think there must be ways in which you can capture those. I mean, I would like to see a lower voting age in this country, certainly down to 16. I don't see why not. And I think there's ways in which you can engage people, in younger people in the debate in that, and to be informed in it. Because then that also, when you give people a sense of agency, you can also give people a sense of hope. And ultimately, if we're going to bring about these changes, we need that hope and optimism to be able to drive them, and that sense of agency, rather than people feeling despair and disenfranchised. And that's what will make a huge difference.
So unusually, I think, for podcasts, or at least for me on this podcast, I got to have a second interview with Craig. I wanted to circle back to a few things he had said in our first interview, and to see whether in the 2 months that had passed, where his head was at. And given the sort of feeling, at least that I get, this tightening of the screw, as 2024 stacks up to be another big year, certainly the biggest election year in history, with 60 countries around the world heading to the polls. Yeah, I wanted to know if he had a slightly different take on some of the questions that I'd asked him in the first interview. So I'm just going to read back from the transcript a couple of things that you said. And there was one I was like, oh gosh, wow, Gillian, why didn't you ask more about this? So it was right early on in the interview.
A little bit nervous now, what you've pulled out.
No, it's all good. You said it.
That's what I'm worried about, Gillian.
Yeah, here we go. So I think I'd asked you about like what happens between being a child and a teenager, where I think a lot of people like, this surely cannot be right, to all of a sudden being an adult going, oh, it's just the way it is, and we can't do anything about it. And in that, you said something like, it's like the system tries to tell us to line up and behave, and to buy into the suggestion that the emperor's got clothes on, as it were. And then you carried on talking about your experience as a 15-year-old going to a careers advisor, and, they just didn't have a box to tick for what you wanted to do. I wanted to go back to the bit about the emperors and the clothes, or no clothes. And I just, I don't know if you can remember, what did you have in mind when you said that?
Well, I think you look all around us. I mean, you take, for example, I was just talking about it, but industrial agriculture, and there is a very live debate at the moment in Britain, certainly, that is framed almost as if it's food or nature. Do we need to focus on food security, or do we need to restore nature? But, if you ask the question, how do we maximise food production for this year, you get one answer, which sure is shove loads of fossil fuel-based fertilisers on the land and trash the land and maximise output for this year. But if you ask the question, how do you deliver food security, say, over 15 to 30 years or longer, you get a completely different answer, where, of course, there's no such thing as food security if nature's in decline. And, a lot of the discussion about modern agriculture at the moment in Britain is a classic example. The emperor's got no clothes. Most of the food we produce in Britain today is almost entirely dependent on fossil fuel-based fertilisers imported from abroad. There's nothing food secure about that at all. And actually, if you're supporting nature recovery, if we're trying to restore pollinators, put carbon back into the soils, put more trees in the landscape, actually even put beavers into the landscape so they can hold water back into the landscape and might make us more resilient for extreme flood events and extreme droughts, that's all going to support food security in the long term. It's a nonsense that, actually, in particular, some of the big farming lobby groups talk about that as if that's getting in the way of food production, when in fact it's actually the thing that we need to secure food production long term. There's so many aspects of our modern life that are propped up on, a mirage really, and they're propped up by, in this case again, fossil fuels. The moment we think we've got to move on from that, for the reasons of climate change, but also because they're not secure, actually you get a very, very kind of different answer. At the moment, Gillian, can you believe, across the Fens, so I'm sitting in Cambridge now, and in East Anglia, you've got the Fenland landscape, which is the breadbasket of the UK, where a huge amount of our food is produced. We're losing soil at around 2 centimetres a year because it's old peatland soils, lowland peatland soils. It's massively dried out, and that's oxidising. The peat is oxidising into the air. So losing 2 centimetres of soil a year, that's not beavers that are doing that. That's not rewilding that's doing that. That's not planting trees in the landscape that's doing that. It's intensive agriculture that's removing 2 centimetres of soil a year. So I think it's a bit rich that you have sometimes farming lobby groups are talking about somehow nature being the threat to food security, when let's face it, it is modern intensive agricultural methods that are making us ever more reliant on short-term, artificial, temporary inputs, often coming from abroad, rather than in trying to improve the inherent capacity of the land. But I could give you so many more examples. I mean, the way our politicians have become obsessed, yet again recently, with economic growth, and actually more to the point, specifically percentage points of GDP. You have at the moment both the main parties, Conservative Party and Labour Party at the moment, trying to argue about who's going to improve percentage points of GDP over the next few years. Now, but there's not much of a discussion about the quality of that economic growth. We need to have much more of a conversation about the quality of economic activity rather than the quantity of it. Because you can have some types of economic activity that basically improve quality of life and improve our sustainability, improve people's health and well-being and education and so on. And you have others that actually detract from that. We all know that, a war is often one of the things that can boost GDP. But that doesn't mean that's a good thing to do. And so right around us, where we look in society now, we have these, I would say there are these plenty of sort of emperors that are actually wearing no clothes, but we're not doing enough to call it out. And we're not seeing that proper discussion in our mainstream politics in the way that we need to if we're going to solve any of these issues.
It's interesting because the suggestion in my mind is that, whether you're talking about Labour and the Tories, arguing about percentage growth in GDP, they actually know this themselves, that this isn't going to be the answer for a thriving, healthy nature with a future to look forward to. Is that the sense that you get, that they know this themselves? And if that's the case, are we dealing with groupthink? What is it that's holding everyone in this kind of, narrative?
I don't know necessarily that everyone knows it as well as we might think, actually, Gillian. It's one of those things that I'm often astonished, actually, about the level of understanding about the kind of issues that you and I work on and just how low it is. I mean, the very fact that you've got, of course, we've entered the age of conspiracy theories as now, where you've got incredibly wacky arguments as to what's causing climate change, because and it's driven not because it's not a real dispute about the science, it's because of a fear of some vested interests or some parts of society about what the measures are that we might have to take to tackle climate change. And you've got very, very polarized, very entrenched positions in a lot of our politics now that are not so much about what the outcome is we really want. It's about saying which side are you on in a debate and which clan are you part of, and are you with us or are you against us? And I think that's one of the things that I've found really quite depressing, I think, in the last 10, 15 years, as opposed to sort of aspects of early in my career, is our politics seems to become so much more tribal. And in the process, actually, there doesn't seem to be much attention to science or evidence or reason or logic. There's not much interest in it. I've talked to MPs before now, to politicians and various debates. Honestly, it used to be the case 20 years ago. You would present evidence and they might be a bit interested. And now the only evidence they're interested in half the time is what that's going to make a difference to voting intentions in particular places. It's quite disturbing. I mean, there's definitely been a marked reduction in my career. I've seen a marked reduction in the extent to which most politicians are really interested in proper science and evidence as to why something needs to happen or not. And I think we've got to turn that around.
Is there a balance to be struck with, yes, evidence-based and data and just looking at good science versus whether they're people of principle in the positions of power? Is there a kind of a tussle between those two or not? I don't know.
I wouldn't even call it a tussle. I think it's actually a point there. I mean, it's no bad thing. It's a good thing to have principles and to have values. And actually, much as I'm saying we need to base decisions on science and evidence and so on, science and evidence doesn't make the decision for you. You still need human judgment based on a whole range of other issues. We saw that in COVID, for example, is how politicians should make decisions. Everyone, I think, probably wanted those politicians to absolutely try and base those decisions on the science, but the science doesn't make the decision. You then have to make value judgments about what's the right thing to do. And that's how decisions should be made. I don't think that's a problem. What I'm saying here is to make a good decision, really, you need three things. You need the science and the evidence and data as much as you can, and recognise that will never be perfect. And, there's always additional data that can come available and will change over time. You absolutely need to make the decisions based on the best values, and you're trying to make the decision in the best interest of all, and so on. And actually, you need good decision-making processes. And often, I think in politics, you don't see those. You don't see decision-making which involves trying to overcome groupthink, for example, or silo thinking. And actually, the longer governments go on, the more they seem to make decisions from deep in their bunker, where they're less and less in touch with real people's lives and so on. So I think there's at least three things that are needed there: the science and the evidence, the decision-making processes, and the values that underpin that. And I think when even one of those goes wrong, we start to face problems with whether we're making the right decisions or not. When you start to see problems on all three, that's an issue. And I'm not even making a party political point here. I just think, this is true because this is happening right across certainly the Western world at the moment. You're not really seeing our politics really focusing on the things that matter, I would say, and certainly not focusing on the scale of the climate and nature crisis and the need to turn that round. And so we're just not seeing the kind of level of action needed, which is why I think it's so important. The answer to this is, like, for organisations like the Wildlife Trust and others, is not about trying to win the arguments in, even if they're metaphorically smoke-filled rooms in Westminster or Whitehall. We have to, as much as we can, engage grassroots and engage communities to drive the change on the small p politics on the ground. I think that's the only way of trying to address this long term, which is why we're putting such a focus into community organising and trying to refresh and rebuild the community foundation that's been there behind wildlife trusts and actually quite a lot of environmental organisations since our start.
So that's really useful, because you've identified like almost three mechanisms potentially for good governance. So that's good quality data and science, good decision-making processes, and values.
Yeah, and I'd say the other, of course, Gillian, is accountability then as well, so that, that you can hold politicians to account and institutions to account for those decisions they make.
I know this is taking it outside of wildlife and nature and what you do at the Wildlife Trust, but it does affect, I'm sure, the way you're keeping an eye on how election outcomes and what that might mean for, the way you run the organization. Like, do you think there's something there about like this cohort of world leaders?
I do. I think actually what we haven't seen for a long time is genuine kind of political leadership in the way that we need to see it. When you think of history, we can probably name some really bold, strong political leaders from the past, and whether you agreed with them or not, they delivered big, bold things. So ranging from Clement Attlee and starting up the NHS to Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s and everything she did, and it's unlikely that anyone would necessarily identify as supporting both of those at the same time. But but the fact is, you could argue very clearly they were both leaders for sure. And I don't know, I don't feel we've seen that for quite a long time, actually, where people had conviction about looking at the problem, looking at a real world problem about what needed to change and trying to build the political support for that change to then happen. And it's funny, actually, when we talk about leadership, often I think there's a bit of a confused stereotype about leadership, which is about forcing things through and the strong leader and all this kind of stuff. Actually, it's no, you're not a leader unless you have followers. So you've got to lead, you've got to bring people with you. It's about trying to build the political support to bring about change. It's being bold and brave in making the case for the change that's needed and so on. I haven't seen that really in our politics for a long time. What I've seen is, and actually not even thinking about the changes that are needed longer term. Instead, what you tend to see is politicians moving from week to week trying to grab headlines to satisfy particular audience segments or political or voting segments or whatever, without really the long-term vision that's needed to drive the big changes we need to solve a lot of these problems. Now, why is that happening? I think it's partly, yes, I think, as I said, social media and a very kind of driven media agenda doesn't help on that. But I think it's a bit of a cliche to say it, but I think more and more we seem to have seen a lot of people that have gone into politics for the whole of their career and don't bring in too many interests from outside. And I think, they've spent their whole life in that political world and, doing political sniping, whatever, that becomes the normal to them all the time, looking at opinion polls, all the time looking at hearing from focus groups and so on. And that's how they're reacting rather than building a big long-term vision about the change that's needed. So I think that doesn't help. And the other thing is actually just we don't have enough diversity of people in making these kind of decisions. I think, the fact if you look at say MPs across the House of Commons now, it might look more diverse than it once did in one sense, is that there's more women in there. They're not all 100% white ethnic as they were not long ago and so on. But actually, probably it's a higher percentage of politicians that have spent their whole life in politics than it would have been 50 years ago. And so they're sort of all living in that bubble. They spent their whole life living in that political bubble. And that's what I mean when I think that my sense of it is politicians are not particularly well connected to communities and the changes that really need to take place and to be able to build that vision that's needed long term. That's my sense of it, Gillian. I'm sure there's many political scientists that will have other interpretations, but I think that's part of the problem.
Well, I asked because, you did in our first kind of, outing when we had that chat back in January, you did talk about being very politically engaged from 13, 14 years old. So I think that's a good long while to be making that observation going, something's changed. I think what's interesting is one of my favorite quotes. I think it's Nelson Mandela in his autobiography said something along the lines of the mark of a good leader is someone who keeps his people together in times of hardship. Obviously his or her people together in times of hardship. And I definitely look around and go, where is that person and where has that person been for the last five, probably 10 years. So I think that's definitely one.
And it's interesting, Gillian, you say that. I've been asked before now, well, why didn't I go into politics, for example, given that I am very interested in politics?
I feel like I should have asked you that.
Well, but I'm going to say, I actually think the whole of my career I have been in politics. What I haven't been is in party politics. And actually, I've said this before, but, I've been asked by 3 parties before now whether I'd think about standing for office. And I find that hilarious that it's 3 parties. I'm quite pleased and proud that they find it hard to pin me down as to where I am, or perhaps parts of the political spectrum. But the point is I haven't done it for 2 reasons. One, because I can't stand the tribal nature of our party politics. It's a big turn-off to me, and actually none of them have massively attracted me. Because I'd rather be able to work across our political spectrum to deliver the outcomes that are needed for climate and nature than just work within one part of it. And secondly, actually, most backbench MPs don't have much influence at all. And I think in the kind of role that I'm in now, I can arguably have a big influence. Sure, if I could become a cabinet minister for a few weeks or prime minister or something, then I'd pull a few levers and that'd be quite fun, I would imagine. But there's just so much about party politics is a real turn-off to someone like me, where I just don't see our politicians working in the way that they could or should across the agenda to try and bring about real change. And I'm being unfair. You can find plenty of exceptions to this. There's plenty of good politicians, don't get me wrong, plenty of MPs that work really hard, and I have a lot of respect for many of them that do that. But overall, I think it's got worse over the few decades of my career, observing it close up, than better. And that's what worries me. There's much less of a sense of duty, public duty, than there once was. Much less of a sense of what are we actually trying to achieve for the country, for communities, for people, for planet Earth, rather than how do we stay in power, how do we get elected, which seems to be driving so many of the conversations now. And that's what I find disturbing. And I think there's a desperate refresh, not just from not just a policy point of view, just a refresh of some sort is needed of our whole political debate in this country and actually globally, I think, to start to focus a bit more on the things that really matter, rather than trying to constantly have what often feels to me like a public school debating society going on and on and on.
I'd mentioned in our first round the paper, The Warning to Humanity, A Second Notice, and I'd said this big sweeping statement, which pretty much on every indicator, on every environmental indicator, things have become exponentially worse. And I said all bar one. And I thought this was a good chance to cycle back and talk about where there was leadership and consensus for a decision and a good outcome for the planet. And you'll remember this as well as I do, about the hole in the atmosphere. You know, you and I were really young when that news story broke. So I was just wondering for our audience, can you walk us through what happened, what it was like for someone like you and I, sort of in our early teens, watching the news, how that was resolved, and why did it work? Why did they end up fixing the problem?
It's a really good question, Julian, and actually it highlights why perhaps I'm nostalgic for some of that time, because what happened is scientists, brilliant British, primarily British, not just British, but certainly British scientists played a really big role in identifying that there was this problem with this emerging hole in the ozone layer, which was a real problem. This was being ozone in the upper stratosphere was being eaten away, as it were, by pollutants particularly from aerosols and so on, by CFC gases, as they were called. Scientists identified that this was a problem, that it would cause huge risk to human and animal health because it would lead to more UV light coming through to ground level, which would cause skin cancers and other problems as well. And so it needed to be addressed urgently. And so the case was very clear. Action was needed. And you had a handful of politicians at the time, actually not least Margaret Thatcher, believe it or not, who took the science and said, right, well, there's a clear problem. We've got to solve it. And so
did she do chemistry? Is that why she
did
understood
chemistry?
it?
Yeah. So this is quite interesting. And she took that evidence and said, right, we've got to make this happen. And of course, there was all the usual kind of industry lobbies saying, oh, this will mean the sky would fall down. Actually, no, it would mean that it would cause loss of jobs and so on. But ultimately, there was a sense, well, we've got to do this. This is the right thing for humanity and for the planet. And they made it happen. And then countries of the world got together and agreed the Montreal Protocol pretty quickly in the scheme of things to start to ban the sale of CFC gases. Now, there were all kinds of aspects about it. It could be a bit better. They didn't close off some of the loopholes, so there was an illegal trade in CFCs for a time. Perhaps the phase out could have been done a bit more quickly, but it was achieved at the end of the day. And you're now seeing the ozone hole improving and actually fixing, which is an amazing turnaround, and it shows what can be done. Now, I suppose what you could say, compared to a lot of the challenges we face now, like climate change, is that was a relatively simple issue. It was one problem, as it were, essentially one set of gases and chemicals that needed to be banned. Countries could come together to focus on making it happen. But at the end of the day, what you still had broadly were political leaders trying to achieve the right outcome for society, rather than to make broader kind of political points and use it for political point scoring. And that's what you see all the time now on so many kind of issues. I mean, even in the kind of global climate talks, a lot of the discussions and the debates that go on and the horse trading back and forth are often about issues that are nothing to do with climate. Trying to get agreement on one thing it might look like it's about methane, but actually behind the scenes it's trying to agree a new trade deal or whatever. And I think that's what I find quite disappointing now, is that how much of those kind of things get mixed up. I mean, perhaps it's always been the case, but it's interesting how you don't have that kind of level of political leadership really trying to drive the outcomes now in such a kind of way that I think would be good and that we absolutely need.
So if you rule the world, only for a day, you don't need to do it for long, like what would you change to, turn the ship around, if you like?
Well, I do think we need much better political systems and governance and so on. And, there's all kinds of sort of policy things I'd like to do in the short term and levers to pull and so on. But ultimately, unless we have proper kind of good democratic voting systems, I would say, for example, much more proportional representation than first past the post if we don't have good systems of accountability and governance in our politics, if we don't have proper respected rules of behaviour, I would say written constitutions as well, and all of those kind of safeguards and institutions in place to make sure that we make decisions for the right reasons, we're going to keep getting the wrong answers. You know, there's a move afoot at the moment to try and centralise a lot more decision making to politicians away from our institutions. Just right at the moment, we're hearing that there's a backbench MP tabling a 10-minute rule bill in the House of Commons to try and say that our sites of special scientific interest in this country should not be decided by Natural England, the government's nature advisors, but actually should be the final decision on that should be made by the Secretary of State. So in other words, you move not from sites of special scientific interest, but we move into sites of political convenience. You'll only ever designate areas for nature where there's no kind of sense that there's an economic opportunity there. And this is centralising decision-making to politicians rather than doing what we should do, is investing in good quality democratic institutions. Institutions are the way that society banks memory. And every time we create institutions, public institutions, we do it because there's been an experience in the past in society that we need an institution actually arm's length from politicians to make the decisions for the right reasons. And at the moment, there's a real attack on public institutions going on and a real attempt to say the politicians always know best. I think if you look at the last 10 years, right around the world actually, the evidence is the politicians are not the ones that seem to know best.
I really loved speaking to Craig and just enjoyed listening to him and his ability to take apart some of these systemic issues, those invisible barriers, or not so invisible at times, barriers to positive change. But I've just got to say something. For the record, I'm no fan of Margaret Thatcher. As a child, I remember watching the miners' strikes on TV, on the news, and even then I was like, this is not right. This is not fair. I've since filmed on nature reserves in the north of England particularly, which were former mining sites and industrial sites. And okay, it is amazing to see how nature bounces back. Give her an inch, she'll take a mile, I always say. And of course, as a wildlife presenter, this is the literal embodiment of hope. But even so, I cannot look away from the people and the communities, as proud and as resilient as they have been, that took some really hard knocks through the Thatcher era. So yeah, no fan of Thatcher or Thatcherism, but it is true. She is credited as being a really key part, a key leader in bringing the world together to agree and take decisive action when it really mattered on what we used to call the hole in the atmosphere, the hole in the ozone layer. And I think this kind of topsy-turvy, contradictory nature of politics still exists today. Just to have a few examples, we've got the US presidential candidate, RFK Jr., who's running on an independent ticket. Now, he gets a lot of heat for his views on vaccine safety. But if it weren't for this, his track record as an environmental lawyer and a prosecutor and an advocate for decades, fighting for people and planet, would make him, or should make him, an absolute legend. In this country, more recently, George Galloway, his views on climate change and climate crisis are controversial. He's been called an outright climate denier. But then you look at his track record in other areas. He's been an all-in veteran anti-apartheid campaigner. Starting during South Africa, he opposed the war in Iraq, and he has been consistent and outspoken on Gaza in what even the highest court in the world has ruled as a plausible genocide. So maybe the take home is we need to be really cautious about labeling people. And we need to look at people's entire track records. Let me know what else you think we need to be looking out for, what other qualities you think are the mark of a good leader. Let us know on the Spotify Q&A function, email on podcast@gillianburkevoice.com. I'm just going to be honest, I suck at Instagram. I massively overthink each post, which means I'm averaging about one post every 2 weeks at the moment, but I'm getting help. So my Instagram and my newsletter should start to pick up soon. So thanks for bearing with me with that. Also, massive thank you to Triodos Bank for their support as exclusive sponsors of If I Rule the World. And of course to the Wildlife Trusts, who have been making a lot of noise about the podcast on their channel since we launched back in November. And of course, helping me to carve out some time in Craig's busy schedule to make not just one, but 2 conversations possible. And actually, now that I've said all that, I think I know what the take-home message is now. While Craig's remit and focus is on his leadership role in one of the UK's biggest nature NGOs, a lot of what he had to say in our conversation about leadership has really stuck with me. And I guess this is the takeaway. No matter where you are in the world, good data, coupled with good decision-making processes, values, and accountability. Maybe that's what we all need to be keeping an eye on. And on that note, take a moment, take a breath, and meditate on all the qualities that the world really needs as we search for good leaders as people of principle who, rather than divide us, unite us. Thanks for listening.